we hear a lot about evolution of all species, but I think we pay more attention probably to animal species. And as gardeners, not a lot of us have like crazy botanical knowledge. Mostly it's practical in the garden, but what should we know about just kind of like the basics of plant evolution?
Well, first of all, I love not being apologetic about being a giant plant nerd. Plants make up 85% of the living things on Earth by weight.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when we're learning about plants, we're really learning in a very deep way about our planet and our biosphere. So it feels sometimes like a little trivial because people care more about animals than plants. But, I think plants are just, I like to say plants are almost everything in quite the literal sense. And, how have plants come to dominate the world so much? I mean, they are the predominant life form on Earth, terrestrial plants. It's really interesting. I mean, one of my favorite narratives about the story of plant evolution is it's essentially figuring out how to have sex with very little water, how to have very dry sex.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that kind of gets you into like the spreading of seeds and all that kind of stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you think about, plants when they were more similar to animals. You go back to our lower plants like mosses and ferns, and they have swimming sperm, right? So their reproductive, organs and propagule materials, they, at some point create a sperm that has to swim through water, just like, humans and mammals, we have that. And part of what plants did in colonizing all of terrestrial land was figure out how to continue their reproductive processes without a lot of moisture around. And so slowly, you get the advent of things like pollen that can be dispersed on the wind or by insects, from flower to flower. And then that pollen opens and no longer does a swimming sperm come out, but a pollen tube, which is kind of like a little root almost, it looks like, that grows and elongates as cell elongation into an ovary to produce fertilization. And that's really unique in the living world. There are no other organisms that are able to complete their reproductive cycle, with water never being sort of a part of that.
Yeah, I always think like now that I'm such a gardener, apparently, the epic gardener, whatever you want to call it, I studied economics in college though. And I've always thought like if I ever were to go back, plant genetics or the hard sciences of some kind would have been my choice, and I would have had a little bit more knowledge in this area,
I think you're doing pretty good. I read your website. It's full of great, wonderful, scientifically accurate information. So, you are doing a great job. Ironically, if I got to go back, I would be an economist.
You really?
If I could do 2 degrees, if I could go back and do one more, I would do economics.
You are president CEO of a botanic garden. Is probably some interesting business acumen you need to develop there, right?
Ideally, we do. One of my great mentors told me that the most important fertilizer for any garden is green, and it is called money. And so we do need to earn money, otherwise we can't grow the garden. So there's some economic principles at play, but plants are my first love. My PhD is in plant biology and mainly in plant genetics. And so I do hear you, and it is fun. Plants do crazy things. They're so different from us because they can't move. So they've since they haven't been able to evolve, locomotion or movement and behavior as we sort of think of it with animals, they've really evolved all this chemical diversity to use to deal with the changing environment that they find themselves rooted in. And that has required a tremendous genetic architecture. Plants, they break all the records, right? So the organism on Earth with the most genes and the most chromosomes and the most genetic material are all plants. It's fascinating just how plants have pushed the boundaries of evolution to the superlative in order to cope with their environment and the fact that they can't move.
So here's a question. It's kind of an oddball question, but I've been seeing it going around just on social media or Twitter or wherever, right? And it's this whole trend towards people who only want to eat meat. And that part of their logic is plants, being that they can't move, they have to evolve sort of ways to defend themselves against predators and consumption, have evolved, and I know this is of course not true across all species, obviously, have evolved sort of protective chemical mechanisms to like dissuade them from being eaten. And they'll say like, oh, well, like spinach has, oxalate in it. And if you eat enough of it, then it's going to kill you. It's like, okay, but the quantity you'd have to eat is so large. It's clearly not a big deal. And I'm not so much asking you to comment on that, but more like, how interesting And are there any interesting examples of that just from your knowledge of plants sort of evolving that kind of response?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, plants, because they're such amazing chemical, innovators, they do fascinating things. And what, of course, there's so many plants that are safe. Obviously, plants form the basis of our system. And even if you eat meat, I mean, the meat ate plants, so
exactly,
it's there in the system. But yes, some of the most profound poisons are come from plants. And one that grows as a weed here in San Diego County and across much of the United States is Ricinus communis. And ricin is a really nasty protein that is very, very poisonous. It's hard to chemically purify it. From castor bean is the common name for that plant. But if you do that, it can kill you very, very, very quickly. Interestingly, that same plant also produces castor oil, which is a really important therapeutic in a lot of senses. So yeah, I mean, plants produce some nasty stuff, and sometimes you need to be careful. But there are very few to almost no reported accidental poisonings with plants every year throughout the whole country based on the data that we have. And so while plants certainly are capable of, and do produce very dangerous chemicals, humans have been pretty good at understanding which plants we can consume and which ones we can't, which ones we can turn into medicines that should be taken but only under very specific circumstances. And most humans are not in the business of randomly eating large quantities of plants that they don't usually eat, and so risk is very minimal and reward is, of course, very high.
Do you ever think, I mean, we can't actually know this, but do you ever think about that whole sort of trope of like the first person to try this or the first person to try that? Like back in the day, how did we figure out mushrooms were edible? Like someone had to go just try it and see what happened. And obviously we've probably lost some human beings to certain things along the way. I've always wondered about that. It's something we can never know historically, right? I mean, it's so many thousands of years ago, these discoveries probably happened, but it's just fascinating to me.
I do. I think about that all the time. And, I think like the simple explanation is, people are out there trying foods to survive and occasionally, eat something like, mushrooms in particular can be very deadly at very low amounts if you don't know the right mushroom. But I also think, there's never been an era, as far as I know, where humans were like really embraced, death very willingly just to try some sort of a new food. And I think, even pretty poisonous things, like for example, rice, and going back to the, castor bean, if you or I were to take one castor bean and eat it and really chew it really well, and we wouldn't die, an adult wouldn't die. We'd feel terrible for like quite a few days, right? And so that's a pretty strong signal not to eat this thing.
Yeah.
And so I think people were always smart. I mean, I think that, when you're eating something new, unless you were really in kind of a starving situation and you had no choice, people would eat small amounts. And, I mean, people probably, we all know today who are the people with the strongest stomachs in our, circle. And, those people, have always existed, and they might try small amounts and be the tasters or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, the bigger risk with plants has always been stuff that is sort of low level toxicity that has like a cumulative effect over time. And, one of the, really strong ones, that affect our food supply. So like ergot is a fungus that affects rye in particular and some other grains that we've used, historically. And, there's some nasty alkaloids in there that really cause hallucination and even death. And some scientists and historians even believe that like the Salem witch trials were sort of mass hysteria caused by, ergot poisoning from rye and, in Massachusetts back in the day. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. But, then again, you don't want to be out there eating rancid meat either, right? So...
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a fascinating thing. I learned about ricin for the first time ever from an episode of Breaking Bad when, it's been such a long time. The show's been out. It's not really a spoiler, but, Walt pulls an interesting move with that compound. So that's how I learned about it. And then I found it out in Santa Barbara hiking in the hills. Oh, right. I was using my Google Lens to identify a bunch of stuff. And it's like, oh, wow, no way. There it is sitting right there.
I mean, it's very common. I see it along the 5 in San Diego all the time, growing as a weed along highways and roads. And there are some beautiful, varieties of castor bean that are sold as ornamentals. And I mean, it's, the leaves are gorgeous, big palmate, reddish leaves. And people have bred them for their beauty.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, so much to learn in the world of plant evolution. Probably could do a whole week. Maybe we'll do that sometime. But good luck in the garden and keep on growing.
Watch the full episode right here and subscribe for more new episodes every single week.